At 2 a.m., the elevator doors closed on a woman's life. Warren felt it before he saw it. The notes of the building at night, hum of the HVAC, distant clack of a janitor's cart in another hall, fell away into a single, wrong sound, a body going slack. He was unlocking the supply closet when the elevator shuddered and the lights in the corridor flickered. The hallway smelled like lemon wax and metal polish. He shoved the mop bucket into the corner and moved toward the bank of lifts because the sound had a shape he knew by instinct, the sudden hollow of someone who had stopped being able to keep themselves upright. The elevator doors were halfway open when he saw her. Vivien Cross, face pale in the dim emergency light, hand clenched on the railing. Her coat was the kind people bought when they measured themselves in meetings. Tailored, heavy, black wool that swallowed the building's night. A security badge flashed at her throat. Her eyes were unfocused. Her mouth was a thin line. She was trying to breathe and failing. Warren's training wasn't formal. It was the accumulated muscle memory of someone who had been awake in the night for a decade. He knew how to place his hands, where to press, how to make room for air when it fought to come. He pushed his palms into the center of her torso the way he'd been taught in a defensive driving course years ago, the way his father had lifted him in emergencies when Iris was small. He counted under his breath. The floors of the elevator hummed with the city beneath them. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed like a thought. He didn't think about who she was, not at first. He thought about keeping rhythm, keeping the breath close enough to return. He felt the give of her ribs under his palms, the quick, instinctive fear that this could end differently. He was a single father. He thought of Iris asleep in their small apartment 2 blocks from here, of the hand-drawn sons and crooked houses that sticky-taped the refrigerator, of a daughter who trusted him to come home every night. Someone, somewhere, had hit the emergency alarm. The elevator jolted, then stilled. He leaned over her, pressing, then bending in to offer a breath the way he'd seen on late-night shows. Not because he believed the dramatics of it, but because he believed in doing everything a man can do while waiting. Her lips were cool. He tasted the stale air of perfume and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. For a compressed moment, the rest of his life narrowed to the sound of his own hands and the sound of a heartbeat he couldn't find. Paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, or an hour. Time in those moments refused city hours. Someone shouted for clear. Lights swung overhead. Hands that smelled of antiseptic moved methodically, trained. Warren backed away because trained hands had to take the lead. He let them lift her onto a stretcher. He watched as they zipped the coat closed and covered her face, and then, oddly, he tugged his glove off and wiped his palms on the leg of his work pants. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with his shift. When Vivien's name came, over the radio, the paramedic speaking in crisp syllables, there was the thin lift of a curtain in his chest. He had seen her badge. He had read the letters. She had been a name in a dozen press pieces he'd never read. The fact of it landed on the tiles like rain. She was someone who ran a company that occupied the top floors of this building. She was someone whose decisions threaded into people's wages and schedules. He had emptied trash from her executive floor that morning, rolled his cart past glass walls and suited figures, and never imagined he'd be part of the most intimate, fragile moment of any of their lives. The ambulance doors closed and the truck hummed away. Security took a statement, which Warren gave in spare, precise sentences. He refused offers. No, he didn't want to press charges. No, he would be fine. His supervisor scribbled a note in a ledger and told him to take it easy, as if this were a minor sprain instead of a night that had rearranged his chest. He finished the shift with the habit of the night, moving through rooms that smelled of coffee grounds and leftover ideas, wiping fingerprints from glass that banked thoughts, balancing janitorial supply against the quiet ego of a man who worked unseen. He pushed the cart past floors that slept. The suits were gone. The lighting in the office gardens was dimmed to pretend dusk even at 3 in the morning. He wiped a conference table where half a dozen narratives once discussed the world. He straightened a chair like a small, lonely act of respect. At home, Iris was waiting with crusted cereal at the table and a drawing taped to the fridge. 3 figures holding hands, a tall one with a mop, a small one with a ribboned hair, and a third with a tiny crown drawn above their head. "That's you and me and the lady you saved," Iris explained, beaming like she'd invented a miracle. Warren smiled and felt the shape of the night press in. He tried to keep the image of Vivien in a box. In the quiet of their kitchen, he folded the memory into the pile of other urgent, ordinary things. He told her a bare version of the truth. "There was a woman," he said gently, "and she wasn't breathing right. I helped until the ambulance came." Iris's eyes widened like coins. She reached for his hand and squeezed. "Was she okay?" she asked. He answered with a look he hoped would steady her. "They're taking care of her." That first night, he watched Iris fall asleep with the light low and the drawing by her pillow. He lay awake listening to the radiator, thinking of the way a single action, his hands pressing, his breath offering, had made a line from his life into another person's. He also felt something else. The sudden, slippery awareness that his hands had touched someone who had more world in her pocket than he did, that a moment's intimacy could never be fully anonymous. 3 days later, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and Post-it notes, a cream envelope lay on his countertop. It had no handwriting he recognized, no badge, just the weight of paper and the particular kind of careful that people with staff-photographed meetings and executives had at their disposal. He turned it over. Inside was a card, printed, "Thank you for saving Vivien Cross." There was an invitation, too, a polite request to meet at the company's building, a time that landed awkwardly in his work hours, and, tucked beneath the card, a number for corporate contacts. Money, he thought at once. Gratitude folded into checks and statements, the way corporations sometimes tried to translate human things into neat reimbursements. Warren was not a man who wanted a medal. He had worked nights for Iris, and every paycheck was an agreement he honored with his hands. He crumpled the envelope into his pocket and thought about what to do. The offer they made, an offer that rippled through his neighborhood in whispers and polite jokes, wasn't what he needed. He wanted something quiet, he knew. He wanted not to be thanked with a check, but to know the woman whose life he'd held had not been left to slip into an indifferent system. When he showed the card to his supervisor at the depot, the man whistled low. "They should be grateful," he said. Then, with the tenderness of someone who'd watched men like Warren do their work, he added, "But don't let it change you. These people, money and flowers, can make folks think they're fixed." Warren folded the card and tucked it in the ledger of his coat. He kept wiping things, sweeping, tying trash bags. He told himself he would do what he always did: work, come home, make dinner, kiss a forehead, and be there. But curiosity is a soft animal. It found him in the quiet. Vivien found him first. She didn't come with a lawyer or a camera crew. She arrived one late afternoon in a coat with the city still bright and a surprise in her hands. Not an envelope, but a handwritten note, honest in the way corporate things often are not. She walked past the security desk with a guard's polite confusion and kept moving until she stood in front of him. For a moment, she took him in. The uniform, the way he balanced a broom like a practiced weight, the way his eyes narrowed when he tried to make sense of someone who wore the world like an armor. "Warren Cole?" she asked. Her voice was trained and never devoid of command, but there was an edge to it that came from having been close to losing something. He nodded. "I'm Vivien Cross. I wanted to say thank you." He wanted to say it didn't require a meeting, that the ambulance had taken care of it, that he simply did what anyone should. Instead, he said, "You should be careful." She laughed, not unkindly. "You sound like my doctor." They stood in the hallway, pulled pale by the building's afternoon light, gold through glass, papers rustling in trash bins. He expected the next thing to be a corporate offer written with PR ink, a check, a gala, a statement. Instead, she spoke differently. "I don't want to pay you," she said. "I want to know you, if you'll have me. His first instinct was to refuse him. He was not naive. He knew public stories bent into headlines, that a CEO's kindness could be a performance. He had seen men with money tidy their guilt into donations and corporate happy hours. But Vivien didn't present a polished apology. She presented exhaustion, a kind of humility that was not theatrical. She wanted to understand what it was like to wake at night on purpose, to watch someone sleep and know your coming back was everything. He saw the way she watched his hands, the practical calluses along the pads of his fingers. He felt, awkwardly and immediately, seen. "Coffee?" she offered, weakly. He almost laughed at the absurdity. Coffee with the woman whose decisions from a steel and glass tower could ripple down to the man who unclogged the toilets. But he thought, this is simpler than an envelope. He agreed. Their first meeting was brutal with difference and gentle with sugar packets. They sat on mismatched chairs in a corporate cafeteria that tried to look collegiate and failed. Vivien spoke with a directness he had not expected, about the moment she'd felt the chest tighten, about the strange collapse of control that had rolled over her. She said the words stress-induced with the medicalist's carefulness, and he watched them cross her face like a map. Guilt, weariness, a hunger to be understood rather than pitied. Warren answered with small truths. He told her about Iris's drawings and how a child can give you something that keeps you upright when the world doesn't. He said nothing about the dead marriage, the paperwork, the nights he had taken second jobs. He let those things be the silence between his sentences, the unlit room behind a doorway. He refused the envelope then in person and watched her face settle into something like relief. Money, she said, is what people lay down to make a conscience stop prickling. He had a conscience that needed less buying. There were late-night emails after that meeting, shorter, less formal than corporate messages usually are. They became a private weather report, how the city's cold bit her shoulders, how the stairwell's echo kept him company, the small, unremarked things that build trust. She sent a photo once of a floor-to-ceiling view from her office, a lattice of light and streetcars. He sent back a picture Iris had drawn of their family. It was inappropriate, in a company sizes and protocol kind of way, and somewhere a compliance officer might have raised an eyebrow. But for the first time in a long while, Vivien was making room in a rhythm not set by shareholder quarterly plans. They began to meet at the edges of their schedules, late enough that his custodial rounds weren't an intrusion, and early enough that hers wasn't a calculated PR move. He showed her a side of the building that wasn't polished for investors, the hollow behind the mailroom, the courtyard trees struggling in planters, the vending machine with the dented soda. She showed him offices with views and the sitter-by-the-window sense of people who negotiated their days with spreadsheets rather than small prayers. In those exchanges, neither offered to fix the other's life. They traded things closer to human matter, small comforts, a warm sandwich, a joke that landed clumsy and somehow right. Iris, inevitably, became part of the conversation. When Warren told Vivien about her, he doesn't do it like a man asking for charity. He speaks of Iris with a pride that is modest and private, a constellation of bedtime rituals, of a voice that sings the same invented chorus each night, of the way she names the moon Mr. Spoon when he appears in their skylight. Vivien listened like someone who had been practiced in hearing what matters and then looking away. When he offered an invitation to bring Iris by the office one Saturday, her answer was immediate. "I would like that." The first time they met in person, Iris trotted up to Vivien like she had done this 1,000 times. She held out a crayon offering, one of the ones with the wrapper torn off and the name of their grocery store stamped on it, and Vivien crouched to meet her smallness. The CEO and the child exchanged something real, a handshake that was clumsy and serious, a promise signaled in the tilt of a head. Iris declared she liked her hair, which made Vivien laugh in that small human sound Warren had started to notice, the one that didn't belong in boardrooms. Domestic life, when it drifted into their evenings, arrived not in grand gestures but in simple economies of time. There were nights when Vivien lingered over Iris's dinner table and asked too many questions about math homework. There were afternoons when Warren dropped by the office with a broken toy, and Vivien took an extra 10 minutes to fix it, her hands precise and soft with things that were not annual reports. There were times Iris would curl into Vivien's lap and fall asleep to a hum of someone who was not a parent but wanted to be near. The first real intimacy between Warren and Vivien was not a scene from a film. It was a kiss in the parking garage, unaggrandized and true. They'd been talking under the fluorescents because it was too late to be anywhere that felt like anything else, because the night compressed the city into a narrower place. Rain had laid a sheen on the pavement. Headlights made halos on the cheap concrete. Vivien's breath hitched over something she said about being afraid. Warren felt the words settle. He moved closer because the distance between them had become an ache. The kiss was a quickness at first, an apology and a testing, and then, when he felt she was there, he deepened it with a gentleness that would not violate the lines they'd drawn. His hands rested at her waist, work-hardened and sure. Her fingers found the collar of his jacket and curled. It was a small, honest thing. It said, "I am here," instead of, "I will save you." When it ended, they were both aware of the world reassembling. A security vehicle idled nearby. Somewhere the city breathed. Vivien's eyes glittered with something she did not want to translate into corporate memos. But in that glow, practicalities began to creep back with the early light of reality. The company, which had the institutional memory of a cautious thing, noticed that their CEO was spending time in stairwells with a night shift custodian. Noticed the photo of him and a child publicly posted on a social feed that someone in marketing could not resist tagging. Noticed the way boardroom chatter bent toward the personal and away from margins. There was a memo, anodyne, the kind corporate life produced to make everything seem reasonable. It read like a suggestion and carried the weight of a warning. Vivien found it waiting on a sleek desk the next day, from a vice president who prided himself on pre-dawn efficiency. Maintain professional boundaries, it said, diplomatic in the way office languages are. Her assistant whispered that the board had discussed potential implications. When she came home that evening with the page folded in her hand, the smile from the parking garage had gone a little stiff. Warren felt the first ripple of consequences on a weekday when his supervisor took him aside by the back door. "You be careful, Warren," the man said, not unkindly. "These places, they notice what they want to notice. Keep your head down." He meant it as protection. Warren heard it as a shape of a new prejudice. He told himself he didn't care what the company said. He told himself Vivien would stand for him if it ever mattered. Between them, the pressure mounted quietly. Vivien's calendar began to fill with board meetings that smelled of legal counsel and strategy. She began to answer emails with a formal cadence that felt almost like armor. Her assistants briefed her in tight little packets about external perceptions. Warren received sideways looks from men who had always smiled at him for the caffeine in their morning mugs, but now seemed to measure him with a suspicion. Rumors are like loose gravel. They shift beneath the feet of a child and make them stumble. Iris overheard a snippet at school. Children with the fierce clarity of 7-year-olds pointing at difference and naming it in the only currency they know, gossip. "She only likes him 'cause he's famous," one classmate said, which turned the story into a strange and small wound in Iris's privacy. He went home that night to find her curled into the couch with the television a balm over reality. They tried to navigate the social calculus with the clumsy seriousness of real people. Vivien started bringing gifts that were ordinary and unshowy, a jar of lemon marmalade Iris adored, a book with pictures of trains. Warren accepted them with a nod and a private optimism he did not voice. He worried about what their friends and neighbors would think. He worried about Iris becoming a target of schoolyard cruelty. He worried, too, about his pride, how to accept attention from someone who could open doors with a phone call without feeling like he was trading his dignity. Corporate resistance took a sharper form when a senior board member suggested that Vivien's relationship could be distracting and that the optics were poor. He spoke of fiduciary duty and shareholder value like a man reciting sacred scripture. Vivien listened, her jaw folding into a tired line. She argued back, not with sentimentality, but with the practical that had made her climb. That dignity at work matters, that employees are not variables to be optimized, but people. The room, warm with catered coffee and cold with power calculations, reacted with a mixture of grudging respect and thinly veiled disapproval. Her actions after that meeting mattered. She could have offered a perfunctory statement, a press release polished and self-congratulatory. Instead, she spent weeks in small, messy, bureaucratic fights. She extended paid sick days for hourly staff in a pilot program. She approved a modest hike to the minimum hourly wage at the buildings she managed, then watched as legal counsels turned the simple act into spreadsheets of sustainability. For every step she took, there was a resistance. A hedge fund wanting margins, a VP warning of precedent, a consultant offering caveats. It was anything but clean. Warren watched from the edges in a way both supportive and wary. He received a formal letter soon after, an invitation to a town hall meeting where her proposed changes would be discussed. He sat near the back, with a thermos his supervisor had given him and a child's drawing in his coat pocket, listening as people he had mopped behind applauded and then questioned how it would be funded. He heard his own name in someone's polite commentary, the janitor who saved her. He felt the label like an ill-fitting coat, necessarily warm in a moment, but not made for staying. There were nights of sweetness broken by practicalities. Vivien tried to meet Iris's teacher to understand classroom dynamics. Warren negotiated schedules with a temp agency for overtime that didn't eat into his weekend with Iris. Money, the practical starch that holds a life together, still had to be accounted for. Vivien offered to help with daycare expenses in a conversation that hovered on the edge of generosity and pride. Warren accepted the help with the same tight gratitude he would reserve for a treasured tool. It was not charity in his mind. It was a rearrangement of the scaffolding of two people's lives. But his father had taught him to swallow pride if it kept a child's room warm and full. Not everyone believed in the quiet honesty of their intentions. A picture on an industry blog, an innocent, behind-the-scenes shot of Vivien handing a toy to Iris, became a talking point for pundits and, in the holidays that followed, a thing for late-night panels to glance at. The narrative the press tried to make, of a dramatic rescue followed by an improbable romance, flattened the complicated human calculus into a cartoon. Vivien bristled. Warren ignored the gossip as much as he could, but it tugged at the edges of something he had long kept steady, his commitment to shield Iris from the more poisonous parts of the world. After that came a 2-week stretch where work calendars and caution made them ghosts to one another. Vivien's board demanded clarity. She was forced into a sabbatical of sorts from public interactions. Warren's supervisor advised prudence. Whispers in the depot solidified into policy talk. They texted less. They missed each other's birthdays in small ways, an unread message that collected like dust on a table. The absence was not dramatic at first. It was the kind that accumulates, a chair left empty, a thermos untouched. When the city blanketed itself in snow, the lack of small rituals, her showing up for Iris's school play, him bringing her coffee, felt like a slow leak. Warren tried to keep the house the same, to keep Iris's routines a fortress against rumor. He took her to the park and pushed her on the monkey bars, let the cold wind slap their cheeks until they laughed. He told her stories about the stars and made up new names for constellations that only they shared. At night, he scrolled through his phone and looked at the few pictures where Vivien wasn't a polished professional, but a person with flour on her sleeve from making pancakes. He let himself imagine a life that looked different than the one he had thought mapped out for him. Less work to catch, more dinners with a real tablecloth. His hands would not let him plan too far. He had learned the hard way that plans are landscapes for weather to change. The last night before the distance would stretch into 2 weeks, they met again in the stairwell of the building. It smelled of cleaning solution and rainwater. Vivien looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She held out her hand, and he took it like a prayer. They spoke quietly about practicalities, and then, because both of them were human beyond their roles, they kissed again. This time softer, more deliberate, an agreement across two worlds. It was as if they were signing a private contract. We will try, even when the world expects us not to. When they parted that night, the city already beginning to wake at its edges, there was a collective intake of breath between them, the sense of a small pause in something that might be large. Neither promised forever, neither promised rescue. They promised to show up where they could and to hold steady where they could not. Warren walked home with Iris's drawing tucked in his pocket, his fingers worrying the edges like a talisman. 2 weeks later, the phone rang at midnight. He didn't pick up at first. He had taught himself not to flinch at the city's bell. But then he did, and the voice on the other end was quick and clinical. It was a nurse from school. There had been an accident. Iris had fallen on the playground and hit her head. They were taking her to the hospital. Warren's feet moved before his thoughts did. He shoved on shoes with one hand and grabbed keys with the other. He left the drawing on the kitchen table where the lamplight made the colors glow. He didn't know then how the 2 weeks of absence, the cooling, the memos, the cooling of small rituals, would shape what came next. He only knew that Pratt Park, fluorescent foyer of a hospital, and the smell of antiseptic awaited him, and that Vivien would have to decide whether this was a time for corporate distance or human presence. He ran because running felt less like thinking. The city blurred, the traffic glared. In his chest was the steady thumping of a man who thought of a child first. He imagined the worst and hammered on the door to the emergency room with a kind of permission that only a father carries. Nurses looked up, then reassured. A doctor asked questions in circles he didn't follow. He heard only, "We're doing everything we can." She arrived, Vivien, so quietly he might have missed her if the world had not stopped in its orbit. Her coat was still wet with rain. She smelled faintly of perfume and paperwork. She sat down without asking and took Iris's small hand in hers as if she had always been meant to be there. Warren watched the way she breathed, the lines at her mouth soften. In the quiet fluorescent hum, something shifted. She was no longer the silhouette that filled his imagination with long, distant corridors. She was a person who he chose, in a hospital that felt like a sterile shore, to stand and watch and wait and be present. This is where decisions begin to harden into shapes. This is where the calculus of what one will risk and what one will protect starts to clarify. But the room was still full of quiet noises, the beep of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the low murmur of a father and a CEO who no longer cared what their titles meant. Warren sat back on a plastic chair and looked down at Iris, asleep now with a bandage hidden beneath her curling hair, and felt the world tilt toward a truth he had always known in small measures. Saving someone else can rearrange the map of what it means to be saved. Outside the hospital window, the city kept moving. Inside that thin fluorescent room, a man who had spent his life cleaning other people's spaces and a woman whose decisions moved markets stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting. They didn't yet know the shape of what they'd have to fight: boardroom pressures, neighborhood whispers, the inertia of money and habit. But for the first time, the stakes were not theoretical. They were personal. And when Vivien reached for Warren's hand, it was a hand that had been calloused by work and worry, and held so steady that he felt the sound of his own breath align with something larger than himself. When Vivien reached for Warren's hand, it was not a gesture meant for press releases or shareholder statements. It was a small, human insistence: "I will be here." Warren felt her fingers close around his like a promise folded into tissue. In the fluorescent hush of the emergency room, the space between title and person thinned so much that what had once read like a job description read instead like a choice. They sat through hours measured by the tick of fluorescent fixtures and the quiet slide of hospital carts. Nurses came and went with practiced calm. The doctor spoke in a voice that tried not to pretend anything but competence. Iris slept under a thin blanket, while a bandage hid the bruise at her temple. Warren kept watch, moving only when the child's breathing shifted. Vivien watched as well, tracing a nonsense map on the vinyl chair armrest with a fingertip. She asked questions without asking to be noticed, about stitches, about rest, about what parents needed most. When Warren answered, he used small words, the words a child understands. She listened like someone learning a new language. The next morning, the ward gave them a careful report and suggestions: rest, observation, cautious appetite for the ordinary. The episode would be recorded in a chart. The chart would live in a system of codes and boxes and insurance numbers. But on the way out of the hospital, Iris rubbing sleep from her eyes, Vivien put a small paper bag into Warren's hand. Inside were 2 muffins and a thermos, labeled with a sticker that said, in handwriting that was neat and slightly trembling, "Get better, Iris." Warren wanted to refuse. He wanted to say that a muffin could not pay for hours of worry. He wanted to insist on privacy and pride. But when Iris looked up and smiled at the sticker like it was the most solemn of gifts, he felt a line uncrossed become a bridge. That week became the first concrete test of what their relationship might withstand. Vivien took leave, not theatrical, but real, pulling herself away from calendar rows and executive chairs into a role she had never rehearsed: the person who sits through the small anxieties of a child's recovery. She checked in at odd hours, not through assistants, but with direct calls, with a voice that sounded like herself rather than a press-ready cadence. She offered practical things, arranging for a pediatrician to visit at home, asking if there were forms or names she should know. She stayed in the waiting rooms and read children's books badly in an attempt at humor. That presence shifted the axis of their interactions from the abstract to the immediate. On a wet Tuesday, when the neighborhood smelled of hot garbage and the city creaked with life, Iris came home and refused to be small about her courage. She announced at dinner that she wanted a Band-Aid shaped like a dinosaur and a new bookmark. Warren fixed her scrambled eggs and told the story of the time he had fallen off a rusted bike and convinced a street vendor to trade his last orange for a Band-Aid. Vivien, at the end of the table, listened and then quietly produced a dinosaur bandage from her purse. Iris squealed and hugged her with a ferocity that made both adults laugh until they cried. Those nights, in their small apartment, Vivien learned about a world that had little regard for clean spreadsheets. She learned why Warren never let a bulb burn out in the hallway. That small maintenance prevented accidents. She saw how calendars in their house were drawn with crayons and grocery lists that doubled as maps of affection. The hierarchies of their lives rearranged themselves into daily chore charts and bedtime songs. Vivien began to ask about school projects and to learn the names of the mothers who ran the PTA. She began to sit through dentist appointments because it mattered to Iris that she did. Each small act piled into the larger shape of a life being reshaped. Meanwhile, at the office, the pushback gathered like hard weather. Vivien's pilot programs, paid sick days, modest wage increases at selected facilities, and a small fund for emergency family needs arrived at boardroom tables like propositions that would erode margins. Spreadsheets turned into battlegrounds. One senior director, who had spent his life treating balance sheets like scripture, argued that such measures were unsustainable and would invite legal complications and precedent. He spoke with a particular coolness, his voice lacquered in corporate caution. "It sets expectations," he said. "We have to consider the fiduciary duty to our shareholders. What looks like compassion becomes a liability." Vivien responded in a tone that had made her a CEO, sharp, prepared, and then, unexpectedly, personal. She told a story of fluorescent rooms and a small girl who called the moon Mr. Spoon. She did not use it as a PR narrative. She used it as evidence, Lives are not line items. For every policy, she offered data, absentee rates, turnover statistics, and a pilot that would allow the company to evaluate impact before scaling. She did not promise instant conversions of culture. She promised to measure, to adapt, and to accept the scrutiny that comes with making change. The board grumbled. Consultants offered equilibrium models and cautionary memos. But there was a human imprint no spreadsheet could wholly erase. The footage of a janitor performing CPR, the child's drawing with 3 figures and a crown. A few board members, quietly swayed by the evidence and by the moral pressure of a CEO prepared to make herself accountable, voted in favor of a limited rollout. It was messy, bureaucratic, and slow, exactly the opposite of the tidy narratives the press wanted, but it began. For Warren, the change unfolded in wrenching, specific increments. He started receiving ridged envelope notices about a new position being opened, a role that would formalize responsibilities he had informally taken on for years, scheduling, training, and oversight of night shift operations across several buildings. A title, a modest raise, health benefits that would ease the constant calculus of one paycheck covering more and more. When he first read the offer, his thumb worried the paper like a man who had been taught to read by the light of a street lamp. He hesitated not because he disliked the idea of more money, he did not, but because he feared what accepting it might mean. Would he be made a token? Would people shake their heads and say the company bought his silence? Would Iris become, in the narrow vision of gossip, a prop? Vivien met him in a small cafe, away from the polished glass of the corporate building. She wore a sweater instead of a blazer. She spoke without slides. "I didn't want to put you in a position where people could say we paid you off," she said. "But we need someone who understands the work. I need someone who will tell me when the plan isn't working." Warren looked at her, at the plainness of her hands wrapped around a paper cup. He thought of nights spent watching sleeping children, of mopping floors to keep a building safe. He thought of Iris and of the steadiness that came from a schedule that no longer tipped every time an emergency happened. He said yes, slowly, and not because the letter demanded it, but because he wanted to shape what that role would be. His first days as a coordinator were less cinematic than he'd imagined. He attended meetings in neutral conference rooms with managers who had never thought to ask the janitors for their insights. He negotiated budget items and argued for replacement parts that, for legal and accounting reasons, had been indefinitely postponed. He sat in front of a training whiteboard and taught a class on safety practices. The guys he'd worked alongside since his first year on the night shift looked at him with a mix of pride and wariness. Some called him a sellout in whispers he pretended not to hear. Others, more quietly, asked opinions about schedules and gear and kids' programs. At home, commerce and affection required constant recalibration. There were conversations about whether to move into a larger place, how to keep Iris's routines, how to share chores without spilling pride. Vivien, unused to negotiating down-to-earth matters, learned to ask what mattered. Whose name should be on the lease, how vacations would be planned, who would pick up which nights. Warren learned to accept help without feeling diminished. One late-night conversation on their small couch ended with them both laughing at the absurdity of being adults and yet discussing whether to keep Iris's old blanket or pack it away. Not every neighbor was approving. In low voices, someone muttered that Vivien had bought her way into a family. Another suggested that Warren had been promoted because the CEO felt guilty. Gossip, like moisture, crept into cracks. Warren held a frank conversation with Iris about rumors, about how people sometimes say hurtful things when they don't understand. He taught her that truth is warmer than gossip, and that their life could be lived by the reality of their daily acts rather than by what strangers preferred to read. The test that cemented something true between them came not from press releases, but from a simpler, sharper place: trust in a crisis. Months after Iris's accident, when the worst fears had dulled but the edges of worry still ran a little raw, Iris caught a fever in the middle of the night. Warren, home early from a shift,
held her while Vivien, who had been listening through the phone, abandoned morning briefings and drove through storm traffic to be there. They sat together on a thin mattress, trading phone calls with the pediatrician and giving honeyed sips of water. Vivien dozed in a chair with her coat pulled around her like a blanket and woke to wipe sweat from the child's brow. That night, without cameras or memos, they made a decision to be a family in the small sense that matters, to show up when the other needs you in the middle of the night, to cancel a business lunch because a child needs a bandage, to make the practical arrangements that love requires. That practical love extended into the workplace in ways both symbolic and structural. Vivien pushed for the pilot programs to be evaluated openly. She invited workers to testify at a company town hall. Warren, who had never been the kind of man to crave a microphone, accepted the invitation not because he loved being the center of attention, but because he wanted to make sure people who worked in the shadows were remembered in policy. He stood at the back of a conference room packed with people, janitors, administrative assistants, engineers, and told a short, direct story about a night when a woman couldn't breathe and a child who trusted her father to come home. He did not use the word hero.
He spoke of urgency and of the dull heroism of showing up for the small things. He spoke of nights lined with cleaning solution and of the dignity that comes from work done well. His testimony moved some listeners. For others, it was a nuisance to be bared. The boardroom calculus shifted, not because of sentiment, but because human faces and names became attached to spreadsheets. One by one, the proposals for broader sick leave and a minor wage increase passed in a textured, negotiated way, not sweeping, but real. There were compromises, pilot limits, review points, parameters that would prevent immediate cost overruns, but the changes were no longer purely rhetorical. They were to be implemented, reviewed, and adapted. As policy changed, so did some of the softer contours of their lives. Warren's new job meant more predictable hours. He could be home for breakfast on some days. He could attend school plays without using sick leave. The stability allowed small luxuries to arrive. New sneakers for Iris without the whispered arithmetic of what must be delayed. It also meant new pressures, a new office, a new scrutiny from his peers, and the perpetual worry that things could be taken away if the pilot failed. Vivien accepted the political cost of pushing reform. Her board's fragile patience sometimes snapped into sharp meetings where precedent was invoked like a talisman. She endured op-eds that reduced her relationship to a headline. But she also found allies, managers who'd seen reduced turnover at properties where workers felt safer, a human resources director who'd crunched the numbers and could show lower absenteeism where sick pay existed. Change moved like a tide, slow, relentless, and full of undertows. It required her to risk reputation in a way that her career had not previously demanded. The domestic negotiations continued. When the time came to look for a place together, the search felt less like a transaction and more like a mapping of priorities. They wanted a house where Iris's drawings could be pinned on more than one refrigerator, where floors were safe for a kid who liked to invent games in which the couch became a mountain. They wanted a kitchen that could hold a dozen breakfasts, not just 2. They compromised on location, closer to school and to Warren's new office, and careful to keep the neighborhood where Iris's friends lived. Moving in was an exercise in humility and humor. Vivien's movers treated the boxes as items to be cataloged. Warren's friends came with pizza and good-humored teasing about the boss lady's china. Iris ran through rooms with the kind of purposed energy only a 7-year-old possesses. She appointed them all. There were nights when dishes were left in the sink and they'd laugh until their sides hurt at something trivial. There were nights when one of them stayed up arranging files while the other packed cereal boxes into cupboards. It was not a smooth montage. Iris walked down the aisle with a crown hastily fashioned from a paper doily and the serious face of a 9-year-old who understood how important she was to the equation. The months that followed did not unfold like a well-edited film. There were meetings to be managed, school fundraisers, a leaky faucet fixed on a Saturday, a board committee that asked for more metrics. But the shape of their life had altered. The company's policies evolved slowly, with oversight and mid-course corrections.
Warren's role developed into a real platform where he could influence the daily conditions for workers. Vivien learned to argue in boardrooms, not only with strategy, but with lived stories. The public narrative, the blog posts and opinion pieces settled into a new, quieter tone. A story about a company that tried something, about the messy complexity of love and labor. Years later, there would be a bookshelf in their living room, filled with files and children's books and a framed drawing of 3 figures, the child with a tiny crown still part of that portrait. Iris, taller and fierce about her own choices, would tell visitors about the night her father had pressed his hands against a woman's chest and, later, how a kiss in a parking garage had turned into a life where people made room for one another. The final truth of their story was not that the janitor's kiss or his single breath in an elevator had magically rewritten systems overnight. It was that small acts accumulate. A man who kept his hands busy with mops and children's bedtimes made a human choice in the face of an emergency. A moment of intimacy, a kiss in a parking lot, a hand squeezed in a hospital corridor, showed a woman that there was life beyond profit margins worth living for. Those acts persuaded a company to test a different approach to workers, persuaded a board to open doors, and persuaded a family to build a home on the foundation of repeated, ordinary commitments. At the center of it all was Iris, who learned that love is less about spectacle and more about the insistence of presence. She learned to tell her friends that people change, and that people who help you at the worst moment often keep showing up. She learned, too, that adults can be wrong sometimes and still make amends. She kept the crown in a drawer in her room and took it out for birthdays. When they looked back, years later, over coffee tattoos of life had left on their mugs, they would tell the story in simple, truthful ways. Vivien would say that she had been saved not by a single heroic act, but by the persistent, ordinary courage of a man who refused to abandon a strange, dangerous moment to indifference. Warren would say that waking to the sound of a child and choosing to stay was the real bravery. Neither would call it a miracle. They would call it a string of choices that, strung together, became a life.
If this story moved you, if it reminded you that an ordinary moment can reshape everything, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this travel because people like you carry them forward. In the end, the elevator where their lives had once intersected remained, for them, a quiet symbol. It was a place where breath met breath, where a kiss sealed a decision, and where a man who cleaned halls became the axis of a very human change. They did not pretend that a single act fixed the world. They knew systems take time. What they also knew was this: sometimes, when you reach for another's hand, you find the map back to yourself. A janitor's hands can hold more than tools. They can hold the careful work of saving another person, and in doing so, saving a life that would otherwise have been arranged around smaller, lonelier things. That was what changed everything.